Hey guys, so today we will be building our very own utility-based CSS framework, just like Tailwind CSS, with the help of simple DOM manipulation. And let's understand the project before we get straight into the code aspects. So let's begin. One second. So as I had mentioned, what is a utility-based CSS framework? I'm sure you guys must have used Tailwind CSS. Come on, it's 2026 now. So you basically write class names, and each class name has a corresponding CSS property and a CSS value assigned to it by the Tailwind CSS framework. And whenever that specific class name is written to any of the specific elements, the styles are appended to each of the specific elements. That's what we are also going to do. It's pretty simple and straightforward. Before jumping into the straight coding aspects, I would still like to understand how are we going to approach it. So what is the very basic approach that comes to our mind is that we need to access all those elements that contain our specific defined class names. And after we have the access to those class, I would say elements, and then yeah, after we have the access to those elements, we gotta access the class names that are written in those specific elements. Then only we will be able to fetch the specific properties and CSS values, right? Because the class name specifically doesn't store the CSS property and CSS value. Technically, it does, it doesn't, but I'll show it to you how it exactly works like. And after we have the access to those class names, we need to check if they do, if they are the class names defined by our specific framework or not, or if they are a random different CSS property that the user or the developer specifically allotted to that specific element. We do not want to consider those specific class names, so we need to filter those elements, those class names as well out, and then eventually we will land with the class names that do exist in a specific object, and within this object we got to check if the specific class name exists or not. If it does, we need to check whether we have defined its corresponding property and value. If it does, we simply got to just append it to those specific elements that it does exist in. And yeah, that's pretty much it. It's pretty straightforward, but there are some blockers or edge cases where this will definitely not work, and we will be talking it in the end of our video so that after you have understood the very basic DOM manipulation, you are able to figure it out yourself that how can you manipulate it in such a way that you can implement it in a way more optimized way. I will be talking about it in the end, but let's now straight jump into the code and understand how things work. This is a very basic HTML template where the body h1 p and my specific class names I have allotted as open. I chose to keep my CSS framework's name as Open CSS, so that's why I wrote it open. You can keep it whatever you wish to, it's completely fine. So that's the basic overview of what is a utility-based CSS framework where you write class names and those class names have specific stylings that we're going to apply. As you can see, I had specifically written down all those CSS class names and its corresponding property values, but you must have observed something. There is no open hyphen over here. Just this text row. So open hyphen is just a signal that it's a part of my own CSS framework, but it has no role to play in the styling or the values over here as well. So we're just going to extract it in the end itself. And before jumping straight into it, what was the very first approach that comes to our mind is that we need to extract the elements containing the specific class name defined by us in our case. What are we going to do? How do we access the elements? We do that with the help of document dot query selector. But I had mentioned we want all the elements, so not just a single element. For that, we are going to use query selector all. Query selector all. We need all the class that contain open hyphen. I'm not going to write it as open hyphen over here because I'll be needing the specific open hyphen in the further code as well. So I'll just store it in a variable for a more easier access. Let's use this framework name is equals to open. You can keep it anything as you wish to, as I mentioned already. And I'm using template editors. You should be aware of template editors if you're approaching with a DOM project. That's the very basic requirement you must have. CSS framework slash hyphen. You will understand why I use it, why I specifically wrote hyphen after the CSS framework name. What does this exactly return is, before that, let's store it in a variable, const all elements. This query selector all basically returns a node list of all those elements that contain our specific class names. As I showed to you, how does it exactly look like? One second, I gotta run the server, and here we go. We have the web page. Am I not consoling it? All right, let's console log it. Log all elements, and we have the access to the node list. A node list is a array-like data structure. Behind the scenes, it's an implementation of a tree, but I would not like to discuss about it currently because we're just working with DOM right now. Manipulation, not the structure of DOM. Document, I would say, not DOM. So yeah, a node list has been returned, and you get each access to each of the nodes. Nodes are the elements, HTML elements. As you can see, body h1, these are all the elements that contain a class name that contains open hyphen. But you can see there is mana hyphen text as well. But that is a part of the element itself. It's not a part of the specific class name. So obviously, if open hyphen does exist, and along with another class name where an open hyphen doesn't exist, it will still return the element because we're just accessing the elements, not the specific class names. So since now we have access to the class elements, nodes, let's say, now we gotta access. We want to access the class names that are specifically written in those specific elements. How do we do that? We do that with the help of a property called class list that is assigned to every node. And what does a class list return? It returns a similar array-like structure with all the class names present in that specific element. Uh, Now, as we know, we have access to the class list, but we do not yet have the access to the individual elements. So how do we get the access to these individual elements? With the help of a method called for each, which helps you to iterate over the entire node list, giving access to each individual nodes. And let's see how does that exactly work like for each element. I'll show it to you that now we have the access to each element. As you can see, now we have access to each element. But we got the elements access, but we want the access to the class list as well, right? So I had mentioned each element node in our case. For easier understanding, let's keep a node. Node has access to class list. I'll show it to you. Oh, my bad. Sorry. Clause. All right. So node class list. Now we have access to all the class lists that contain the specific class names. Now we need to access those individual class names. How do we do that? Just like we did it in a case of node, we access it with the help of for each method. Node dot class list dot what is it? For each current class. Now I'll show it to you that we have access to all the class names as you can see. But I had mentioned I only want those specific class names that start with open hyphen so that I can separate it out and see if it belongs to my specific CSS framework or not. How do we do that? As we can see, it is a class name that is being returned is a data type of string. So we have a method with string called starts with that helps us to see if it starts with the specific substring that we will mention. As you will see, class dot starts with CSS framework open hyphen, which will return a Boolean value, true or false. If it does, it will return a true value. If it doesn't, it will return a false value. So we will be able to filter out these two specific classes out, and you will see it how. Let's style key before jumping straight into it. As I had mentioned earlier, I'm not storing open hyphen. I'm just storing the text after the open hyphen. So we gotta extract those specific text out of the open hyphen. I mean, we basically gotta extract the open hyphen out of the main string. So how do we do that? We do that with the help of a method called slice that helps us to extract a particular substring from a larger string overall. How do we do that? Is current class dot slice to mention the starting index and the ending index. We don't have to mention the ending indexes. We just want all the text after open hyphen. So we just gotta mention the starting index. And how do we do that? We have the length of our specific open, and there is a hyphen as well. So for that, we got to include that as well into the consideration. So we add +1 for it, and all substring after open hyphen will be returned to us. Let's say we store it in a variable so that I can show it to you guys, since we will be needing it in the future, as not in the future, further ahead. Style key, my bad. I guess it will become confusing for you. Let me just comment it out. Yep. You can see mana text. The mana text class names are completely wiped out. They weren't considered because they were not starting with open hyphen. We got only those class names that do start with open hyphen, and we have successfully extracted those defined class names that we have defined in a specific object. In our case, it's the open styles. And now the final filtration that is required. What if I had written something like open hyphen blah 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 that doesn't exist in a specific temporary database or object, I would say. In that case, it will still process it, but we need to filter that thing as well out. So what do? Is we check in the object that the current class name that is the key for an open style exists or not. If it does, it will return a true since this will return an object. Why will it return an object? Because that's the value we have assigned. If it doesn't find a specific key linked to our object, it will return undefined. And undefined is a falsy value. Falsy value and undefined is a falsy value. So what happens is basically it will just skip the if statement. So we don't have to do anything for that. But since we are currently using all those class names that do exist in a specific open styles object, we just got to now append those styles to our individual elements since we have performed all the filtrations required. After the filtrations are done, what do we before so I mean yeah, what we can do is before jumping straight into writing the code, I would like you to understand one more thing that each node, just like it had a property called class list that returns a class list of class names. Similarly, there's a property called style that returns an object of CSS properties. Just like margin, padding, and whatnot. So you can simply access that as well. So how do we access that? We access it with the help of a node style, my bad, style. But we need to get the access of the property. And how do we get the access of the property? As I had mentioned, each class name has a corresponding object, assigned property, and a value. So we just gotta access the property. We know how to access the particular object, just like we did it over here. We're simply gonna do the same thing over here as well. We got the access to the object, but now we need access to the property as well. So we simply use a dot operator to access it. Now, how do we access the value? Similarly, just like how we did it for the property, we'll do it for the value as well. So open styles dot value, and simply we just appended all the styles that are there, and you can see the CSS has been applied successfully. And yeah, that's pretty much it. But before ending this video on a lighter note, I would like you guys to think, what if you wanted to add or you wanted to add pseudo elements like, let's say, hover, focus, and whatnot. So you you need you can't use media queries in a inline styling way, right? And for using pseudo elements, you need the access of the CSS selectors like the HTML tag, class, ID, or anything related to that specific CSS selector. But in inline styling, you can't specifically write hover and write the style and it will work. It doesn't work like that in inline style CSS. So how do we tackle that kind of a situation? And another situation is imagine you're using 50 buttons or let's say any component, 50 components repeatedly, and they contain all the same class names. Now, in our current approach, what are we doing is exactly we're iterating over all the elements that contain our specific class names. But is there really a need to iterate over all the elements that contain our same class names? Why can't we just, create a common area where they can simply access it from there rather than iterating over all element and then appending the styles for each element? That's just going to hit the performance, make the code even more cluttery, and it's not so optimized. So how are we going to exactly deal with that kind of a redundancy? Because that will surely hit your performance when you start building a lot of stuff with similar class names and all. So how do you tackle with that situation? These are the two blockers that I had mentioned earlier over here that I'll be talking about. Will like you to think about it and try to understand what can you exactly do. I'll give you a small hint. There are two approaches to it. The very first approach that came to my mind was why not we can do some manipulation where we can just push all the CSS to a separate CSS file. But browser unfortunately does not have access to the files due to security reasons. So the third last option left was there is a style tag that we used inside the HTML element that mimics like a separate CSS file where you can write all the CSS including the media queries and pseudo elements. But how do you, with the help of DOM manipulation, achieve such kind of an objective where all the CSS is specifically being pushed to an style element? And how do you handle modifiers like pseudo elements and media queries, and how do you exactly deal with them? Would like you to research a little bit about it and think about it. Surely I'll be making a video on it because I have made the project itself, but this is my first video, so it's quite overwhelming for me to continue and take that project itself in the same video as well. So yeah, that's pretty much it for today. Hope you liked it, and yeah, I would appreciate constructive feedback, be it my fumble or my explanation or whatever you wish to say. Because, yeah, it was my first time after all, but yeah, thank you. All right, bye bye.